Hello and welcome back. I'm Desmond Annabrank, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. In the previous video, we prepared our budget section using the spending plan worksheet and discussed the purpose of each budget category. In this final video, we'll transfer everything we've prepared into the application form, complete the remaining budget questions, finish the final sections of the application, including proposed use of SEMAC funds, anticipated outcomes, and the evaluation plan, and then submit the application. At this point, most of the planning is already done. Our goal now is simply to transfer the information we've already prepared into the application form while taking a closer look at a few sections that deserve a little more explanation before you submit. So, without further ado, let's finish your application. All right, so we are back for the last video of the series, and what you're seeing on your screen is what we've worked on in the last video. This was the SEMAC spending plan worksheet, the tool that you could use to help you work on the budget so you don't have to scroll up and down in the application form. This worksheet helps you to look at the budget in the bird's eye view. We've talked about this in the previous video, but today we're going to transfer what we have in the spending plan worksheet and transfer it to the application form. So if you have completed the spending plan worksheet from the video before, this part should feel much straightforward. Rather than building your budget while navigating the application, you're simply transferring the work you've already prepared. We'll work through the sections in the same order they appear in the application form. And since we've already prepared everything in the spending plan worksheet, every now and then I'll pause the video again, just like what we did in the last video, while I transfer each section in the application form. And once I'm back, we could take a quick look at what I've inputted, and then we could discuss a bit, and I'll mention any tips while we're looking at that section, okay? So let us go back to the application form and let's get started. Okay, so here we are in the application form, and we will start from the spending plan. I think I've mentioned most of these things in this particular category in the last video. So in general, I'm just going to recap what we've discussed. In general, I explained that these are the budget categories, and whatever you select would be reflected under here, and whatever you don't select won't pop up below it. So if you decide to delete any of the fields after, let's just say you're working on the spending plan worksheet and you realize, oh, I don't really need an in-state travel, you could simply uncheck the in-state travel and it would disappear. So pretty straightforward. And then the bottom of this section reminds us about that, but it also reminds you to itemize and explain your calculation methods. So, and then the examples would be in green. So for this video, let's go to the artistic fees, honoraria, and stipends. Again, this is an example of the format that is expected. And so I'm going to pause the video. All right, so I've inputted this, what you see on your screen here, based on what we worked on yesterday. So I got the 900 for artist fee, and then I broken it down to artwork, labor, materials, 12 pieces, etc., etc. And then art handler, labor, install, and maintenance, 3 hours, $50 per hour, lodging, etc. And then $0 for the research and development, and the total is $1,400. Okay, so before moving on, make sure that you take a quick look at your entries again. Make sure that each budget item appears on its own line. Your calculations are clear. I double checked when I moved it into the application form with a separate calculator, I checked the numbers again and made sure that the subtotal is still reflecting the numbers that I've included in the text box. So everything looks good, and let's continue to cost of evaluation. Again, I'm going to pause the video while I enter this section from our worksheet. All right, we are back. I've pasted what we've included in our applicant journeys worksheet the other day. Whoop, I forgot to put in the subtotals, but I'm going to double check with my calculator here. Yep, 120. But other than that, I think we've included everything for tailing. $40, 3-foot clear plastic tubes, plastic end caps, tubes. I'm not sure why it's flickering, but yeah, apologies. Jeez, that's really distracting. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Okay, anyway, I've pasted everything from the worksheet. I just am missing this part here, and that should be good. One thing I want to remind you about cost of evaluation is that it cannot exceed 5% of your SEMAC grant requests. We'll double check all of that after we inputted everything. Okay, now let's move on to the equipment and non-expendable items. Again, I'm going to pause the video and then we'll talk more about this section. All right, I am back and I've included what we've put in the worksheet yesterday, 10 mini trial gagium, a breakdown of it, shipping and handling, and import tax, okay? One thing I want to mention, if you've included equipment and non-expendable items, you'll notice an additional question asking you about the future use of the item that you are proposing to purchase. And so let's take a look at Sujin's answer of future use, and then we'll talk more about it, okay? After the grant project is complete, the mini trial gagiums purchase will continue to be used in future educational and community programs. I plan to incorporate these instruments into Korean culture camp in Rochester. In addition, I intend to develop this project into an ongoing series of participatory performances and workshops to be presented at nursing homes, libraries, and other community venues with support repeated public engagement activities. Okay, so I can see that rather than simply saying the equipment will continue to be used, Sujin explains how it will support future educational programs, community partnerships, and additional public engagement opportunities. When answering this question, you should think beyond the immediate project. More like, how will this equipment continue supporting your artistic or cultural practice? Will it allow you to create future work, offer additional workshops, expand your programming, or reach new audiences? Reviewers aren't simply looking for confirmation that you'll keep the equipment. They're trying to understand the lasting value of this investment and how it will continue benefiting your practice and your community after the grant project has been completed. So it's another thing that you should also think of, because this will be considered by the reviewer when they review your equipment and non-expendable items budget section. And now let's move on to expendable supplies and materials. Again, I'll pause the video and we'll be right back. All right, so we are back, and as you can see, we've included everything from the worksheet, including the description, and I made one with brackets and the rest without, just with the previous format that I've been using, just to show you that, the example shows that you could use brackets, and I just wanted to give you an example that that's how it will look like with brackets. Completely a personal choice. You could go with brackets or not. It would be completely fine for the reviewers as long as it's itemized and it's clear. And I've checked the numbers again. Everything is good. But I want to mention about this small part here at the bottom of the expendable supplies and materials. This section isn't asking about items you're purchasing with grant funds. Instead, it's asking about materials, equipment, or supplies you already own and plan to use during the project. This section is often overlooked, but I actually think it's a great opportunity to strengthen your application. For example, imagine you're proposing a painting project, but reviewers don't see paintbrushes or easels or other basic supplies included anywhere in your budget. They may naturally wonder how you plan to complete the project. If you already own those materials, this is exactly where you can let reviewers know. Although these items aren't included in your project budget, they help reviewers understand the resources you're already contributing. More importantly, they demonstrate that you've carefully planned your project by answering questions reviewers might otherwise have about how certain activities will be accomplished. It's a small section, but when used thoughtfully, it can give reviewers greater confidence that your project is well prepared and ready to move forward. So keep that in mind if you have expendable supplies and materials in your budget. Now let's move on to in-state travel. Again, I'm going to pause the video and I'll be right back. All right, so I've pasted these items here from the worksheet, the mileage for 5 site visits, 485 miles times by 0.72 per mile. And Lydia also mentioned or added this part here and this part, and she added mycology. So you could definitely still add more details when you're actually transferring from your worksheet to the budget. Try to think from how the reviewers would read this, and if you have ideas of how to better break down the sentence, how to make it as much more detail as possible, then that's great. Okay. So yeah, I've included all of this here, and I recalculated the subtotal, everything matches. And before moving on, confirm that all travel takes place within Minnesota and that your mileage calculations use the current IRS standard mileage rate, which SEMAC would generally recommend when estimating travel costs. So let's move on to publicity. Now, I will pause the video and I'll be right back. All right, we are back, and I've pasted the Facebook and Instagram ads, $75, the breakdown, and then printed promotional materials, $195, and then the breakdown, and then the $60 for community newspaper advertisement with a total of $330. So that is the publicity section, and notice that we don't have rental or space equipment below publicity here. The reason is because we did not include that in the spending plan. If you remember, it's those checkboxes. One reminder before moving on, publicity activities funded through the grant cannot begin before your project's approved start date. Make sure your publicity timeline reflects the start date you've selected elsewhere in the application. It's earlier in the part of the application form. It's also worth taking a quick look through your publicity expenses to make sure they clearly reflect how you plan to reach your intended audience. Remember, what you're building in your application form is a storyline, and you want everything to be connected to each other. So it's important to look at it that way. And then a detailed publicity budget helps reviewers understand not only what you're promoting, but also how you plan to engage the public with your project. So again, I mentioned that rental of space or equipment, we did not include that in the spending plan section, so it's not here. So I won't complete that section. But if your project includes rental costs for venue, equipment, or specialized tools, this is where those expenses would go. That actual section is where those expenses would go. So, one important reminder: fees paid to your public engagement venue cannot exceed 10% of your CMAC grant request. So, be sure to review those calculations carefully if that category applies to you, definitely before you submit the application. And then I did not include other expenses as well. If your project includes an allowable expense that doesn't clearly fit into any of the previous categories or budget sections, you can include it under other expenses. Before doing so, though, it's always a good idea to review the grant guidelines and just make sure that the expense is actually eligible. Let's move on to double check your spending plan. Um, Before moving on, you'll see a short list here titled Have You Remembered To? This is another section you need to complete. It's simply a final reminder to review your spending plan before continuing. I recommend you doing this exercise either after you filled out all the sections or before you submit, but definitely make use of this because it's pretty important. These are all small details, but they're also some of the most common reasons applications are returned as incomplete. So it's worth taking a few extra minutes to review everything before moving on. Okay, but we'll be talking more about total expenses and CMAC grant requests. So once you've reviewed your spending plan, enter your total expenses followed by your CMAC grant request. Remember that your total expenses should include the cost of your entire project, regardless of where the funding comes from. Your CMAC grant request, however, is simply the portion you're requesting from this CMAC grant. In our worksheet from the previous video, the entire project was within the maximum grant amount. It was, if you'll look at this, 53, it's flickering again, I'm sorry. I'm not gonna pull it there. It's 5365. So I could paste it here. And so since it's under that maximum CMAC grant request amount, you should have that exact same number reflected in the CMAC grant request, or you could ask for less. Um, Either way. So in this scenario, the numbers would match, but then again, let's imagine a scenario where your total expenses exceeds the CMAC grant request, right? Let's just say this is 7,500. That means you cannot choose all expenses to be paid by CMAC just because your total expenses is more than the CMAC maximum grant request for an advancing artist, which is 6,000, and it is 4,000 for an emerging artist. So keep that in mind. In this scenario, the total expenses is more than the CMAC grant request, so I have to choose either some expenses will be paid with other funds or additional expenses will be paid out of pocket. And when you choose either one of these two, it will open up a branching section here called propose use of funds. So let's see, if I choose all expenses to be paid by CMAC, that part would disappear. But when I choose some expenses would be paid with other funds, it'll show up, the proposed use of funds will show up over here. So now let's review that proposed use of funds. All right, so since we've indicated that CMAC won't be paying for every project expense in this scenario, the application form now asks us two additional questions. The first asks us to identify which budget items the CMAC grant will actually pay for. The second asks where the remaining project expenses will come from. Okay, I'm going to pause the video. I'll paste an example of how to answer both of these questions, and I'll be right back. All right, so I've pasted this example for the use of SEMAC funds. Let's go through it together. So remember that we worked on the worksheet in the last video. Well, another good thing about the worksheet that I really like is that working on this use of CMAC funds part, I actually just looked into the subtotal of each category and pasted these numbers with the subtotal title. So you can see here, it's the artistic fees, honoraria, and stipends, and then evaluation, non-expendable items, expendable supplies and materials, in-state travel, and publicity. Those were the things that we inputted in the worksheet in the last video. But then, since this is a scenario where the actual budget goes way beyond the CMAC maximum CMAC grant amount, I've added here. Let's just say in this scenario, we've added an other expenses. And in that other expenses, there is this liability insurance for $1,000. Now, remember that our final number on the worksheet was 5,000 something. Hang on, let me just have a quick look at it. It was 5,365. And then the liability insurance is 1,000. So putting that whole 1,000 in there would make us go over the maximum amount of the CMAC request. So I'm proposing for a partial payment of $635, which would bring the whole number up to $6,000, which is the maximum request amount for an advancing artist. Remember, in this example, I'm an artist, I'm an advancing artist. But in the real world scenario, if you are an emerging artist, then your maximum amount should be no more than $4,000. Anyway, circling back to this example, so we've included a partial payment, and remember that that is definitely possible. You could include a partial payment of a certain category or budget section in this use of CMAC funds. Okay. And then let us talk a bit more about the other funding. In the other funding, I've included two examples that basically answers this question. Other funding is basically asking you, if the CMAC grant won't cover everything, then what would you do with the remainder of the budget? So basically, in this two examples, one of them is for a scenario where I will be paying for it out of pocket. And the answer is the remaining liability insurance and space rental expenses will be paid out of pocket. So in this scenario, I have the liability insurance, which was 1,000, and then another rental expense, which would make it 7,500. Anyway, so that's an answer for if you're paying it out of pocket. And remember, you don't have to list these items. It says here you do not need to list these items line by line. Just tell us who will cover the remaining amount. And then in the second example, I said the remaining liability insurance and space rental expenses are expected to be covered through a micro grant that I'm currently applying for. Those are perfectly fine and accepted answers for other funding. So please choose depending on whether some expenses will be whether you're choosing some expenses will be paid with other funds or additional expenses will be paid out of pocket. Awesome. Now let's move on to anticipated outcomes and evaluation. All right, so the next section is anticipated outcomes and evaluation plan. This section is required by the Minnesota State's Arts Board and helps demonstrate how your project contributes to the broader goals of Minnesota's arts funding system. Rather than writing a narrative or response, you'll begin by selecting one outcome statement that best reflects the primary impact of your project. Take a moment to read this part of the application form, read closely the options, and try to find one that would reflect your project. Think back of everything you've already described throughout your application, like your project summary, narratives, public engagement component, and artistic goals. Your outcome statement should feel like a natural extension of those earlier sections rather than a separate decision. And then once you made your choice, I'm just going to go with one of them here. Minnesotans learn, grow, or change because they participate in quality arts experiences. And then I'm going to move on to evaluation methods. So you are asked to choose one or more methods you'll use to evaluate the anticipated outcome. Rather than asking you to explain your evaluation process in a narrative response, this section is simply asking you to identify the methods you'll use. There's no single correct answer for this question here. The most appropriate method depends on the type of project you're proposing and the outcome you've selected. Before we begin entering participation numbers, I'd like to point out something that I think helps applicants worry a little less about these questions here. These participants' estimates are not part of the review criteria and they will not affect your application score. SEMAC collects these information for reporting purposes and also to better understand the anticipated scale and reach of grant funded activities across the region. At this stage, a thoughtful estimate is all that we need. We understand that actual participation may change once your project is complete. The first field here is asking for the number of artists or culture bearers that are involved in your project. Um, Remember to include yourself. Even if you're the only artist involved, this number should be at least one. If other artists or culture bearers are actively participating in the project, include them as well. So, as an example, I'm just going to put in three. And let's move on to the next one. Estimate the number of youth you expect to participate in or benefit from your in person activities. I would just put in 50. And let's move on to in person participation by adults. This is asking you for an estimate number of adults you expect to participate in or benefit from those same in person activities. I'm just going to put in another 50 here. And then we also have this online participation question. For this one, if your public engagement also includes an online component, you'll see two additional fields asking for estimated online participation by youth and adults. I don't think you can see the second one, but there we go. So you see these two over here. And then, as with the previous questions, these don't need to be exact. Simply provide your best estimate based on the information you have today. So I'm just going to put in here just 20 and let's just say 30 adults, making a total of 50. All right, at this point, you've reached the end of the application form. Before clicking submit, I'd encourage you to take a few minutes to review your application one final time. Make use of this part over here if you haven't, to make sure that your budget sections are crystal clear. You, these are just basically checkboxes. So basically, complete the fields for the budget categories that apply to your proposed grant activity. Check. Round budget items to the nearest $5. Check. List dollar figures on the left margin. Check. Place each budget item on a separate line. Check. Double check for math errors. I did that when I was putting things in here. So make sure that you do all that, but also remember to look into every required question. Remember, required questions are those with the asterisk at the end of the question. Make sure that every one of them has been completed. Make sure that your URLs are all working correctly. It leads to the right page. Make sure that your dates are all accurate, start date, end date, the specific date for your public facing component, and then make sure that your spending plan matches the rest of your proposal. And finally, make sure that there are no spelling errors or grammar errors, or most importantly, calculation errors, because calculation errors could actually put your application back to draft. And you will have to revisit the application, fix that number, and resubmit your application. So it's always good to recheck everything before you click submit. I'd also like to remind you about one requirement that's easy to overlook. Remember that your venue contact must send an email to staff@semac.org confirming that the venue is available and accessible on or before the submission deadline. If CMAC doesn't receive that confirmation by the deadline, your application will be disqualified. Okay, keep that in mind. Once you've reviewed everything, you're ready to submit your application. Go ahead and click the submit button. I'm going to go and click the submit button so you get to see what happens. There we go. You see your application has been submitted. After your application has been successfully submitted, you should receive a confirmation email at the email address associated with your grant interface account. If you don't receive a confirmation email, don't assume your application was submitted successfully. Instead, contact CMAC staff or me at staff@cmac.org, or call us as soon as possible so we can help determine what happened before the application deadline passes. Okay? And then I just want to quickly talk about what happens next. Once you've submitted the application, there are just a few important dates to keep in mind. First, remember that the deadline is July 28th. Again, it's that email that your venue contact has to send to me confirming the venue is available and it's accessible. And then after that, make sure that you check your email frequently just to make sure that you will respond immediately if I would to contact you to ask any questions, or asking you to fix anything real quick before your application gets sent to the reviewers. So the panel review meeting will take place virtually on September 2nd and 3rd. All applicants, all reviewed applicants will receive an email invitation to observe the meeting. Final funding recommendations will then be presented to the CMAC board on September 8th, and all applicants will be notified of the results by email on September 9th. Okay? If your application isn't funded, reviewer comments will generally be available in your grant interface about 2 weeks after the notification email. I encourage you to read through them carefully. They're one of the best resources for strengthening a future application. Please remember that not receiving a grant doesn't necessarily mean your project lacked merit. In every grant round, there are more strong applications than available funding. Take time to review your panel feedback, reflect on it, and consider applying again in a future round. Every application is an opportunity to refine your ideas, strengthen your project, and become a more confident grant writer. Congratulations on reaching the end of this video series. Whether this is your first grant application or you've applied to a SEMAC grant before, I hope this series has helped you make the process a lot more approachable and given you a better understanding of not only how to complete the application form, but also how reviewers think about the information you're providing. If you have any questions at all at any point during the application process, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I'm Desmond Annebrandt, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. You can email me at staff@semac.org or call me at 507-281-4848. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I wish you the very best with your application, and I hope to see your proposal this grant round. Goodbye.